Welcome to this video on the top 10 vampires of Clan Tzimisce. This will be my longest video so far, but if any clan deserves long-form treatment, it is Clan Tzimisce. At one time, the Tzimisce were the most powerful clan in the world. They were the unchallenged masters of every inch of land between the Danube and the Dnieper rivers. But they fell prey not on the battlefields, but they fell prey to their own complacency and arrogance. Rivalries and infighting between Tzimisce lords prevented them from crushing the upstart Tremere from their own lands, from uniting against the German and Hungarian Ventru, and later, the Anarch Revolt, which saw the destruction of their antediluvian. Supposedly. In the modern Knights, the Tzimisce are a decaying and decadent aristocracy. They have retreated into formality, esotericism, hedonism, and ancient grudges, to protect themselves from a world that has little place for immortal, feudal lords. But without further ado, here are the top 10 vampires of Clan Tzimisce. Number 10. Yorak. The Tzimisce have a reputation for being an exclusively Carpathian clan, but Yorak was the first and possibly the only progeny of the Tzimisce antediluvian to have been born in the region. Yorak was a native of what is known as Transylvania in the modern Knights. Yorak was embraced by the antediluvian in approximately 8000 BC, placing it as one of the most ancient of Methuselahs, if not a literal antediluvian itself, depending on when you believe the Great Flood took place. It makes sense, therefore, since, according to the Fiends, their antediluvian had left the first city long before the Flood and had made its residence in the Carpathians. To give a little more illustration to just how insanely old Yorak was, in 8000 BC, agriculture was at the cutting edge of science. When the antediluvians sank into torpor after the flood, and the antediluvians' brood departed from the safety of their Carpathian strongholds, Yorak remained. Like his sire, Yorak had been seduced by the whispers of the demon Kupala, and grew strong in the power of Koldunic sorcery. Additionally, Yorak was equally enthralled by the philosophy of the antediluvian, the road of metamorphosis, the possibility of attaining apotheosis, transcendence, nirvana, the next step in vampire evolution, whatever you want to call it, through total mastery of the flesh. During the Second Bali War, the Salubri warrior Samuel attacked the Tzimisce antediluvian and struck it down, though the warrior died in the battle as well. But the antediluvian did not stay dead. Instead, the Tzimisce antediluvian reformed itself through the blood and spirit of its most beloved child, the Dracon. The Dracon carried the embryo of its sire to Yorak for safekeeping and went on about its business. Yorak soon after began constructing the holiest site of the Metamorphosists, the horrifying Cathedral of Flesh. The cathedral required the bodies and blood of tens of thousands of mortals and vampires, as they were physically, mentally, and spiritually broken, violated, and reshaped to form the floors, walls, and pillars of the Methuselah's cathedral fortress. Pools of blood were surrounded by chairs and benches formed from still living bodies. Walls were lined with mouths that wailed and sang as one passed by them. Pulsating, shuddering organs, bone, and viscera comprised the walls and pillars of the cathedral. And anybody who lays eyes on this thing should lose a point of humanity right off the top, and make a self-control roll to keep the contents of their stomach down. In addition to pursuing the path of metamorphosis with the most brutal exercise of architecture ever devised, Yorak established his political dominance over the Carpathian Tzimisce by claiming the title Voivode of Voivodes. In his capacity as overlord, Yorak recruited itinerant Gangrel, Bruja, and Nosferatu as vassals, using them as an expendable buffer between the Carpathians and the expansionist Roman Empire. Finally, Yorak is responsible for the creation of the Zadruga, or the Tzimisce Revenant families, who straddle the line between mortal and vampire. Yorak cultivated these mortal lines in the same way a breeder cultivates hounds for certain purposes. Some, such as the Basarabs, the Premisils, and the Grimaldi, were bred to rule mortals. Others, like the Bratoviches and the Kazi, were created to fight and protect their Tzimisce masters. Others, like the Zantoviches, or Zanatosa, were to serve the Tzimisce and be grateful for the privilege. Yorak would meet his end in the 15th century, destroyed by his greatest creation, You see, the Cathedral of Flesh was not merely a nightmarish amalgamation of bodies hammered together by a master of flesh crafting. By the 15th century, it had developed into a kind of gestalt life form with a collective consciousness that straddled the line between ghoul and vampire, both fueled and held enthralled by Yorak's potent blood. In 1472, Yorak summoned the deposed Wallachian prince, Vlad III, to attend him within the cathedral. Vlad occupied a peculiar position within Clan Tzimisce. Some wanted the prince dead for the crime of capturing and slaying Tzimisce in order to take their blood and make himself an independent ghoul. But Vlad was also the subject of a powerful prophecy, one that claimed that he would have unmatched influence among the Children of Caine in the future. Yorak decided that Vlad would make a powerful addition to his brood, and offered him the embrace. But as Yorak offered Vlad the embrace, the Cathedral of Flesh, possibly under the influence of Kupala, or even the Tzimisce antediluvian, chose this moment to rise up and attack Yorak. The Cathedral of Flesh ripped Yorak to pieces with dozens of fanged tendrils and devoured the Methuselah's blood and flesh, while Dracula, and a meddling coterie of vampires, escaped to have adventures in the future. Vlad III, or Vlad the Impaler, would become one of the Tzimisce, though it would be on his own terms. Number 9. The Dracon. Some vampires are reflections of their sire's personalities and goals. If Yorak is the embodiment of the Tzimisce antediluvian's mad desire for apotheosis, the Dracon is the Tzimisce antediluvian's need for knowledge of the world and itself. If Yorak is the Tzimisce antediluvian's most trusted child, then the Dracon is the antediluvian's most beloved child. Like his brethren, the Dracon is ancient, since the antediluvian sired most of its childer in antiquity. However, the Dracon's people were, wherever they came from, whatever language they spoke, has since been long lost to humanity. To try and comprehend the mind of an antediluvian, especially one as inhuman as the eldest of the Tzimisce, is an exercise in futility. Exactly what compelled the eldest to select the Dracon is unknown. The Dracon was a boy when the antediluvian claimed him for itself, though it did not embrace the Dracon immediately. Instead, the antediluvian allowed the Dracon to grow to manhood under its watchful eye. On the fateful night, the antediluvian summoned the Dracon to it, and gave the Dracon what it had not given any of its other progeny, a genuine choice. The Dracon could accept the antediluvian's embrace, or he could leave, live and die as a mortal, and the eldest would never interfere with him again. That moment, that choice, has defined the Dracon forever since. The Dracon regarded himself as the vessel and preserver of his sire's humanity, its capacity to comprehend emotion and feel passion. When Samael slew the eldest, the Dracon bore his sire's seed and consciousness until he gave birth to a thing that terrified him. The Dracon left the infant vampire god with its broodmate Yorak and left the Carpathians. In the intervening years, the Dracon developed his own unique view on the path of metamorphosis. He was not merely content to change his flesh. He would change beliefs and even civilizations in pursuit of discovering apotheosis. While sequestered in study on the Isle of Cyprus, the Dracon met the Toreador Methuselah Michael. Now I won't rehash too much of what has been covered in the top 10 vampires of Clan Toreador, where Michael's relationship with the Dracon and the general history of vampires in Constantinople is gone over pretty thoroughly. In the Trinity system in Constantinople, the Dracon and his Obertus monks were responsible for the esoteric philosophy of enlightenment that would fuel the dream. Cracks arose when the Dracon came into conflict not with Antonius, Michael's other lover and ally in the dream, but with Michael himself, who oversaw the Orthodox Church and its clergy. This conflict was reflected in mortal society as the Monophysite heresy, as monks under the Dracon's supervision believed in the holy divine Christ, while the Orthodox clergy promoted the dual nature of Christ as all man and all God simultaneously. The Dracon also grew weary of Michael manipulating Antonius and himself into petty competitions for Michael's favor. This alienated the Dracon from Michael and Antonius for a time. The Dracon responded by undermining the strength of Constantinople, propagating the view, through his Obertus monks, that the outbreak of bubonic plague was a sign of God's displeasure with the city. In the 7th century, the Dracon actually got the better of both Michael and Antonius. Heraclius, born from the mortal followers of the Dracon known as the Akoimatai, rose to the throne of the Byzantine Empire. As the monastic orders grew in power, the Dracon promoted iconography, depicting certain famous Tzimisce as saints and objects of veneration within the Byzantine Empire. The rise of Islam greatly troubled the Dracon, and he launched his most ambitious project to date in the first quarter of the 7th century, the Library of the Forgotten. The Dracon set his Akoimatai monks the task of transcribing numerous volumes and works collected from all over the known world, primarily from the Great Library of Alexandria. Despite his conflict with Michael and Antonius, the Dracon never wanted to destroy the dream or even weaken it. His only desire was for Michael and Antonius to not take him for granted. The Library of the Forgotten was to be his contribution to the dream, the transformation of Constantinople into the greatest seat of knowledge in the world. When the Library of Alexandria was burned by Arab invaders in 642 AD, the Dracon grieved. By the close of the 7th century, Michael tried to make peace between himself, Antonius, and the Dracon with the gift of Jesu and Simeon. In 701 AD, a child of Triglav the Three-Headed, broodmate of the Dracon, arrived in Constantinople bearing a message from their mutual sire, the Tzimisce Antediluvian, a warning to the Dracon to not embrace Jesu, or disaster would follow therefrom. This warning was the first sign of a discontent of the Carpathian Tzimisce against the Dracon. They regarded his enthusiasm for monasticism and Christianity as a heresy against their largely pagan clan. The Dracon disregarded the warning and embraced Jesu in 702. Almost immediately, Jesu fell into torpor and could not be awakened. The Dracon, convinced that the Carpathian Tzimisce had struck Jesu with some Koldunic curse, left Constantinople and rampaged through the Old Country for a year, an act that is still remembered with dread by the Carpathian Tzimisce. At its culmination, the Dracon met and fought Triglav in a confrontation that shook the mountains for miles around. At its end, the Dracon removed Triglav's sobriquets, leaving his brother quite headless and very dead. This was the beginning of a conflict between the Draconian Tzimisce and the Carpathian Tzimisce that would wax and wane for centuries to come. When the Dracon returned to Constantinople in 703 AD, Jesu awoke from torpor and embraced his brother Simeon. Antonius, who had been promised Simeon for his own brood, was outraged, and the rift between he and the Dracon was irreparable. In retaliation for this perceived betrayal, Antonius elevated Leo III to the Byzantine throne and began the iconoclasm, seeking to destroy the Dracon's cults of veneration and blood worship. Meanwhile, the Carpathian Tzimisce retaliated against the Dracon's followers in the Balkans and Greece, setting fire to many Akoimatai monasteries and killing the Dracon's vassal vampires. In 796, when Antonius's disloyal childer, Septima and Caius, proposed to murder their sire, the Dracon and Michael reluctantly consented, seeing no other way out of their conflict with their partner and lover. It was only after Antonius was dead that the Dracon realized that he had loved Antonius just as much as he had hated him. Weighed down with regret for Antonius, and despairing of Michael's growing madness, the Dracon left Constantinople in 888 AD, leaving his brood in the hands of Jesu and Simeon. The Dracon was never seen again. However, after the fall of Constantinople in 1204, the vampires who had conspired against Michael and the Dream each met an appropriately humiliating downfall and death, possibly engineered by the Dracon, as a last show of love and respect for Michael and Antonius, and the dream that they had all once shared. Number 8. Velya and Elaine Cassidy. One of the triumvirate, along with Lugaj and Sasha Vykos, who led the Anarch Tzimisce in rebellion against their elders, Velya is a vampire of legend among the Sabbat, though few have ever met him. Velya is a grandchild of the Tzimisce Antediluvian, and his mastery of blood magic is rivaled only by the warlocks of Clan Tremir's inner council and the oldest of Assamite sorcerers. As for the practice of Koldunism, that elemental power born of the Tzimisce's bond with the Carpathian Mountains and the demon Kupala, Velya is without equal. Younger Sabbat revert to Velya as the Flayer, or the Vivisectionist, for his mastery of vicissitude. His peers simply call him Velya. For him, that is title enough. Velya is the second cardinal of the land beyond the forest, and directs Sabbat efforts in Eastern and Central Europe. To sow chaos, Velya provokes ethnic conflicts, terrorism, purges, and war to prepare the way for the Tzimisce to eventually reclaim all of their old domains. He also spends time summoning ancient spirits to wreak havoc against the Tremere Chantry in Vienna. He is, or was, so advanced along the path of Metamorphosis that Velya considered the war between the Camarilla and the Sabbat and the Jihad to be mere trivialities, a chore carried out with all of the cold, calculating precision that an ancient Tzimisce can. And yet, Velya's perfect control is a mask, one that is slowly crumbling as he is slowly being destroyed from within. Millennia of enemies have failed to destroy him, and yet he may be dragged into hell by the creature that has given him his greatest delight, his child, and his bride, Elaine Cassidy. And now it's time to get creepy. In the late 19th century, Velya was in Boston, Massachusetts for reasons known only to himself. There he witnessed a 10-year-old girl from an old-money Boston Brahmin family successfully manipulate and destroy her entire family. Elaine drove her mother catatonic, successfully engineered an unfortunate but fatal accident for her sister, and had her elder brother committed to an asylum. Yes, sociopathic Tzimisce lolies are a thing. And Velya did what any sensible vampire would do when confronted with a deranged and homicidal child. He wedded her and then embraced her. Yeah, wholesome stuff. But the thing is, even the most maniacal and predatory child is no match for the level of insanity and evil that is the norm within the Sabbat, or the path of Metamorphosis, which is equal parts Hellraiser and Johann Liebert from Monster. And Velya, being so divorced from humanity for thousands of years, failed to notice when his bride's monstrous but fragile psyche was collapsing under the demands of both the Sabbat and the Path. Though, it does make sense, as considering the needs of others is an actual sin for a metamorphosist. Sometime in the middle of the 20th century, Elaine fell to the beast and became a wight. And it was at this point that Velya decided to become a big old Tzimisce cream puff. Rather than do the sensible thing and put a stake in his child bride's tiny little heart and leave her in a sunny spot, he cut off her legs and then flesh-crafted her onto his back until he could fix her. But unless you are one of the children of Osiris, there is no fixing the beast. So now Velya's blood and Elaine's freely mix in a beautiful, destructive blood bond. Elaine's beast constantly goads Velya's to join her in the peace of total madness. Velya's methodical and detached demeanor hide a desperation to hold both himself and Elaine together. His most common tactic is to keep Elaine sedated and docile, but his retainers are noticing their master's lapses in personality and failed experiments. When Velya falls, and he inevitably will fall, the cardinalate of the land beyond the forest will fall with him. But at least, he will have Elaine. Number 7. Vladimir Rustovich. If ever there was an archetypal old-world Tzimisce, it would be Count Vladimir Rustovich. Standing at 6 feet tall with saturnine features, he is the precise blend of nobility and evil that once defined his clan. Even from birth, Vladimir's life was overshadowed by the Tzimisce, as his family, the Rustovichs, were a Balkan offshoot of the Bratoviches, a ghoul-revenant family cultivated to serve the clan as warriors. The Rustovichs were noble but poor relations of the Bratoviches, their ancestral holdings being little more than a tuber patch surrounded by an earthen stockade. But Vladimir came of age and joined the Tzimisce's wars against their Ventru and Gangrel enemies beneath the banner of House Rustovich. When Vladimir rose to rule the house in his own right, he ruthlessly expanded his domain over a decade until he was the lord of a vast tract of land with a sprawling fortress at its heart. Vladimir's martial prowess managed to draw the attention of the jaded Tzimisce Voivode and Koldun Kochesiku, who granted Vladimir the embrace in 876 AD. Rustovich ably and dutifully served his sire as warrior and lieutenant. In 983 AD, when Kochesiku fell to an attack from a pack of Shadow Lord werewolves, Rustovich quickly declared himself voivode of his sire's lands. All who attempted to challenge him were destroyed save 2. Misha and Siskos, who fled into the forest. Rustovich spent the next centuries in various wars against numerous enemies, rival Tzimisce, the Ventru, the Gangrel, the Shadow Lords, and the newly minted Tremere vampires. Even to this night, the Tremere occupy a place of hatred in Count Vladimir's unbeating heart, second only to the Shadow Lords. The Tremere's start down the road of vampirism came at the expense of one of Rustovich's retainers named Roland, and Rustovich learned of Roland's fate at the hands of Goratrix thanks to the dead Tremere mage Ponticulus. Rustovich's ferocity in battle led to the ancient Yorak ceding the title of Voivode among Voivodes to Rustovich, while Yorak pursued the mysteries of Metamorphosis. When Count Rustovich wasn't terrorizing the battlefields beneath his bat banner, he held court in his sire's former castle, now known as Castle Rustovich. The Count had a taste for beautiful women, literally and figuratively, and many disappeared over the centuries within the haunted walls of Castle Rustovich, either to become the Count's evening meal or to join his harem of vampire brides. In 1313, Vladimir Rustovich traveled to the Old Country to defend Tzimisce holdings against an attack by the Teutonic Knights. The attack was easily repelled, almost too easily, it seemed to Rustovich, but with his duty done, he returned home, or rather, to what was left of his home. Misha and Siskos returned to Castle Rustovich while its master was away. How they managed to secure an alliance between Rustovich's Tzimisce rivals and the Shadow Lords remains a mystery, but they attacked the castle, tearing apart Rustovich's retainers and his vampire brides, even his most beloved Elisabetta. Rustovich's frenzy against the Shadow Lords is legendary, and is still a tale used to frighten unruly pups, of the great, bloodthirsty man-bat, and the slaughter he visited on the warriors of the tribe, before fleeing the ruins of his castle for safety among the Carpathians. Rustovich joined the Sabbat for no better reason than revenge against the Voivodes who conspired against him. When he and his anarch allies finally caught up with Misha and Siskos, the vengeance he extracted from his faithless brothers was so awful that even other Tzimisce who were present shudder at the memory of their screams. In modern nights, Count Vladimir Rustovich is a lonely, bereaved wanderer. He remains a nominal member of the Sabbat, though the good of the sect is secondary to the vengeance he seeks against the descendants of the Shadow Lords who sacked Castle Rustovich and killed his brides. Number 6. Zachary Sikorsky. In the top 10 vampires of Clan Toreador, I implied that there was another angle to the death of Sabbat Regent Melinda Galbraith. Well, meet the other angle. Zachary Sikorsky, Regent Galbraith's impersonator and very unwilling successor. Zachary was born in the 1960s in New York, and he was always just a little bit different from the other boys. That's to say, he liked putting on his mother's clothes when she was out of the house. Like most young cross-dressing boys, he got caught. Zachary forgot to completely clean the makeup off of his face. Maternal empathy was not on the menu for young Zachary as his mother beat him, both to vent her own confusion and frustration, and in the vain hope that she could beat the gay out of him. It should go without saying that attempting to beat the gay out of someone hardly ever works. As Zachary became a teenager, he was subjected to taunts of faggot and queer routinely. Catching hell at home and at school while trying to work out not only what goes where, but where you want to put the aforementioned what, can be trying for a teenager. It's honestly amazing that adolescence doesn't kill more people than it already does. By the age of 16, Zachary was out on the streets of New York after coming out of the closet to his mother. He had to hustle for a living, and did so by adopting a female persona and appealing to those Johns who needed a little bit of deniability for their own sexual picadillos. When he turned 18, he could work in the bars instead of the back alleys. He also performed on the drag circuit, which is where he came to the attention of Daniel Murphy, a Tzimisce and member of the Sacred Band Pact. The Sacred Band Pact was predominantly gay and lesbian, and thought Zachary's performance was so entertaining that he should join them. Murphy embraced Zachary and gave him the creation rights in 1996. Despite being young, Zachary took to existence as a Tzimisce with relish. He quickly developed his skill at vicissitude to enhance his appearance and impersonations to perfection. There's a little bit of curious throwaway information on Zachary. He is, or was, a follower of the Path of Lilith. Now, the Paths of Enlightenment are a video all of their own, but the Path of Lilith reveres the Dark Mother and the attainment of wisdom through pain and ecstasy. The path is also considered heresy within the Sabbat, right alongside the path of evil revelations, which is demon worship. So, where did young Zachary pick up this little bit of wrong thinking from? The odds are his sire, if not his entire pack, were followers of Lilith, and therefore heretics, given how tightly knit Sabbat packs tend to be. Short version, Zachary was already hanging out with a bad crowd by Sabbat standards and tempting final death. And speaking of tempting final death, Zachary also impersonated many Sabbat notables for the entertainment of his fellow vampires. His best and most famous impersonation was of Regent Melinda Galbraith. Now, Galbraith, despite her reputation as an utterly merciless killer, took Zachary's performances with good humor and invited him down to Mexico City for the Pala Grande in 2000, and even granted him an audience to do a little flesh crafting on her before the commencement of the festivities. When Zachary arrived, however, he found Galbraith's rapidly decomposing corpse, along with a symbol drawn on the wall of her penthouse. Naturally, he did what any young vampire would do. He freaked the fuck out. Now, no one would be stupid enough to believe that a 12th generation Tzimisce less than a decade old could have gotten the drop on a centuries-old 5th generation Toreador anti-tribu like Melinda Galbraith. But with New York conquered by the Camarilla, the Sabbat would descend into another civil war if Galbraith's assassin were to simply escape. Zachary would be offered up as Galbraith's killer, if only to keep the sect stable until a new regent was selected. And Zachary was not prepared to die for the good of the Sabbat, just yet. With mere moments to spare, he did his best impersonation of Galbraith, intending to escape from Mexico City once the Pala Grande was over. Yet, the regent is hardly ever alone, and Zachary is now trapped in the identity of Melinda Galbraith. The longer the deception goes on, the more terrified and paranoid Zachary gets that he will be exposed. If the Sabbat doesn't frame him for Galbraith's murder, they will kill him for carrying on the deception for as long as he has. And meanwhile, Melinda Galbraith's real killer remains at large. Number 5. The Rose. The Tzimisce known as the Rose was born as Allison Benson. As a child, Allison was sexually abused, causing a psychosomatic condition resulting in her being unable to experience physical sensation, such as touch, taste, or smell. Everything to her was dull and hollow. What little emotion she felt came off as callous and cold, and in time she had alienated everyone around her. As a university student, she engaged in self-mutilation, drugs, BDSM, just to feel something, anything. Eventually, she developed a taste for torture, and not of the safe word variety, her only pleasure coming from the misery and pain of others. The police finally caught up with her. She was tried and convicted for the murders of 5 of her lovers, male and female, who perished during her torture sessions. But Allison also had an admirer, the type of vampire who appreciates such artistry, a Tzimisce, who plucked Allison from her cell the night before her sentencing hearing and embraced her in the typical Sabbat fashion, with a shovel to the back of the head and a hasty burial. Allison awoke in the cool darkness of her coffin. Aside from ravenous hunger, she noticed the roughness of the wood scratching at her back, the humidity of the water as it formed on her skin, the smell of the dark earth around her, the pain of the wound that the shovel had left on the back of her skull. Where other vampires feel terror or fury at being forced to dig themselves free of their own graves, Allison felt joy. She could feel. Her joy turned to frenzy as she tore through the cheap wood, through the freshly overturned earth above her, and emerged from her grave, reborn. She turned on her sire, first wanting to feel his skin in her fingers. Then she smelled him. Perhaps he would taste just as good as he smelled, she thought. Before her sire could defend himself, she was ripping into his throat, not drinking him, but devouring him, his blood, his soul, his memories, his feelings. Overwhelmed by passion and hunger, she disappeared after diablerizing her sire. She used the memories gained from the act to hunt down and kill the rest of her sire's pack. Now that she could feel, she had become more dangerous than before. Once her blood had cooled, she was properly inducted into the Montreal Sabbat, though she stood at the outskirts of the sect and joined no pack until she formed, or rather reformed, a pack of her own, the Widows. Alison's widows are the second iteration of a much older pact, created by a Toreador anti-tribune named Lilia. Lilia was a follower of the Path of Cathari, a theology that places vampires in the role of immortal spiritual jailers of humanity, chaining their victims to the material world with pleasure, wealth, and sensation, so that they do not seek spirituality and enlightenment. Those who reject the wiles of the Cathari are worthy of liberating themselves and rejoining God as pure spirit. Lilia and her coven were destroyed in 1907 when an unknown enemy firebombed her haven. The sole survivor of the arson was Lilia's only child, Veronique Lecruel, future Archbishop of Montreal and lover of Kyle Strathcona, former Prince of Montreal, then Archbishop, and now Sabbat Cardinal of the Northern Territories. Veronique made no attempt to re-establish the widows, and the pact was forgotten for a time. Alison stumbled into the ruins of the widow's old haven and made it her own. Using her auspex, she was able to look into the past and learn about the widows in the Path of Cathari. She rebuilt the haven, using the flesh and bodies of victims lured inside with promises of sexual favors, some of which were given. When a Toreador anti-tribune named Monique Kim arrived in Montreal in the early 1970s, she sought out and joined Alison in her pursuit of the Path of Cathari, and so, the widows were reborn. By the late 1970s, Alison was known as the Rose, and rebuilt her haven as a brothel called the Heart, catering to the elite of Montreal, both mortal and vampire, whose tastes were too dark and perverse to be satisfied elsewhere. The widows act as mistresses and dominatrices, not only to powerful mortals, but to local and visiting members of the Sabbat. The widows maintain their clients' trust by never, ever violating their privacy. The Rose never divulges the identities or secrets of her clients, no matter what they may scream out as she sends them to the heights of pleasure or plunges them into the depths of pain. During the reign of Archbishop Sangris the Serpent, the Rose was named as a Bishop of Montreal. But politics are of little consequence to the Rose. She uses vicissitude to make subtle alterations to herself. She is consistently androgynous, but never appears exactly the same any given night. She also fluctuates between male and female voices, the better to keep her clients and victims, and sometimes there is no difference between the two, both transfixed and off balance. Among Sabbat Cathari, especially the Americans, a journey to the heart is something of a sacred pilgrimage, and the Rose is an exemplar of the path, whose knowledge of pleasure, pain, and excess is inhuman. But for the Rose, that is the whole point. Number 4. Radu Bistri. Radu Bistri is an oddity within Clan Tzimisce, for he is a diplomat. Oh, make no mistake, Tzimisce of his generation are hospitable and polite in keeping with the Tzimisce definition, but Radu prefers to negotiate with allies and enemies alike, instead of the typical Tzimisce policy of terrorizing and brutalizing both one's allies and enemies into submission. Radu's sire, Velya, was one such Tzimisce, who preferred subjugation and slaughter, yet found that these tactics were insufficient to deal with the Ventru of Hungary. Radu was born in 1100 AD as Radu Zantovich of the Tzimisce Revenant family, known in modern nights as the hedonist and degenerate Zantosa. Radu served his mortal lord as a diplomat and spy to the lands to the west of his native Transylvania. His hour came when Radu learned of a scheme by the Hungarian Ventru to establish an alliance of Transylvanian vampire lords in opposition to the Tzimisce Voivodes. This alliance was later to be known as the Council of Ashes. Velya granted Radu the embrace in 1125 AD to advise Velya on how best to handle the Arpad Ventru and then infiltrate the Council of Ashes. Radu succeeded beyond his sire's wildest imaginings. The council granted Radu rule of the city of Bistris in Transylvania. Radu further sank his talons into the Council of Ashes by kidnapping the designated messenger of the council, a gangrel named Tiberiu, and then forcing him into a blood bond, giving Radu free access to all the sensitive information from the other princes, information that found its way into Tzimisce hands. For centuries, Radu of Bistris was the spokesman and mediator for his clan to the vampires of Western Europe. He was erudite, polite, knowledgeable, and charming. Then the Anarch Revolt broke out. Radu stood in opposition to the Anarchs, at first, but packs of Anarchs chased Radu out of Bistri, forcing him to take shelter in a 200-year-old fortress in Tihuta Pass. Eventually, Radu did join the Sabbat, though he laid out a precondition for his membership. He was invested as the first cardinal of the land beyond the forest, essentially Transylvania and the surrounding Carpathians. This placed him between the slavering packs of bloodthirsty Sabbat and the remaining Tzimisce Voivodes too powerful to be put to flight by a handful of misbehaving childer. Once again, Radu succeeded in his task, recruiting several Voivodes into the Sabbat peacefully and organizing the Transylvanian Tzimisce against the might of the Camarilla. In fact, Radu of Bistri, now Radu Bistri, was a bit too successful. Regent Gorkist, a fellow Tzimisce, summoned Radu to the New World as the First Sabbat Civil War raged to assist the La Sombra Archbishop Polonia in imposing some semblance of order on the unruly Sabbat fledglings of the American colonies. With a heavy heart, Radu surrendered his title of Cardinal of the land beyond the forest to Velya the Vivisectionist and boarded a ship bound for New York. Prior to Radu's arrival, the Sabbat had largely been a free-for-all. Murder and diablerie were the orders of the day, and the Sabbat in the colonies squabbled over domain while the Camarilla quietly took root in the New World. The Tzimisce diplomat went on a whirlwind campaign up and down the eastern seaboard to negotiate, bargain, and threaten the various Sabbat pacts and bishops into some semblance of order. On September 19, 1803, after President Thomas Jefferson authorized the Louisiana Purchase, the Sabbat Regent Gorkist, witnessed by Cardinal Radu Bistri, signed the Purchase Pact, which forbade open war between members of the Sabbat on penalty of final death. In the modern nights, Radu Bistri retains the title of Cardinal, though he is itinerant as he holds no domain. He laments the state of the modern Tzimisce, regarding the current crop of anarchic fiends as unworthy heirs to the voivodes and warlords of old. After the 2000 Palo Grande in Mexico, Radu has also expressed frustration at Regent Galbraith's unwillingness to grant him an audience. I wonder why that might be. Anyway, Radu's frustrations notwithstanding, his most recent project has been the recruitment of several Gangrel elders who inexplicably abandoned the Camarilla. Number 3. Lambach Ruthven. The Tzimisce have a long history of cultivating mortal, revenant families. Some were bred to serve, like the Bradoviches, others to rule, over the mortal herds and provide the Tzimisce with a pool of lords to embrace from, such as the Ruthveni. The downside to aristocracy is that you might end up with a mighty philosopher king, or you might end up with a weak-willed coward. The Tzimisce Lambach Ruthven ended up being very much the latter. Despite being born to privilege and power, Ruthven lacked confidence or courage. He was elevated above worthier men by simple accident of birth, and squandered the wealth and influence his ancestors had built up before him. Ruthven dreaded the idea of being embraced, and suffered greatly during the 3-hour ritual at the Hans of Tabak that inducted him into the clan. After his embrace, he became withdrawn, anxiety-ridden, and desperate, even as his fellow voivodes called upon him to govern his lands, manipulate mortal politics, and fend off the rampaging anarchs. Lambach rarely lived up to expectations. When the anarchs reached Tabak's keep, he summoned his childer to die for him while he made his escape. Lambach survived his encounter with the anarchs and was given an ultimatum: join or die. The anarchs had no love for the cowardly Ruthven, but they did have a use for him. He knew the location of the Tzimisce Antediluvian's torpid corpse. After Lugaj broke the blood bond, Ruthven, terrified of the insane mob of vampires surrounding him, led the anarchs to Cernog Monastery. The eldest guardians put up a hellacious fight, but in the end, the anarchs prevailed. They shattered the magics protecting the Antediluvian, and Lugaj personally committed diablerie on the Tzimisce founder. But Lambach Ruthven saw something very different. He saw how feeble the Antediluvian seemed, how little resistance he gave to having his soul devoured. He peered at the Antediluvian's crumbling body and noticed evidence of masterful, subtle, and almost imperceptible flesh crafting. Ruthven began sweating blood as horror filled his cold body. All around him, anarchs howled and bayed in triumph. Ruthven's second sight pierced the veil of a potent magic spell. As he approached, he saw Lugoj, the real Lugoj, hung from the ceiling on a wooden hook jammed through his chest, like a side of beef in a larder. But if Lugoj was on the hook, then who was standing in the middle of the Anarchs, basking in their praise? He turned back to see Lugoj standing before him, smiling at him. But it was not Lugoj. It had stolen Lugoj's face, his eyes, his smile. But as Lambach felt it peering into his soul, he knew what stood before him, the Tzimisce antediluvian. It had replaced its own torpid body with a flesh-crafted fledgling. In the chaos of the battle, it had replaced Lugoj and impaled him on that wooden hook, then concealed the act with powerful magic. The antediluvian leaned in close to Lambach and spoke 4 words that have haunted Ruthven's every waking hour for over 500 years. Be a good lad. As Lambach looked on, the antediluvian, still disguised as Lugoj, claimed that he must go into torpor, weighed down by the antediluvian's fresh but heavy blood, and that he would return on the eve of Gehenna for them. Lambach returned to his usual state of affairs after this, manipulating mortal politics on behalf of the Sabbat Tzimisce. His sire, Tabak, even joined the sect. It was Ruthven's incompetence that would see his sire's death and the rise of Vlad Dracula. Ruthven tried to insert a fledgling into Dracula's court as a spy. Dracula caught the vampire and not only wrung the secrets about who was behind the dynasty attempts to steal his throne, but took the vampire spy's blood to make himself an independent ghoul. Tabak, exasperated by his child's ineptitude and Dracula's resilience, took a force to Wallachia to depose the Impaler Prince. Instead, they all walked into Dracula's trap. Dracula had informed the Camarilla of Tabak and Ruthven's coming. A force of Justicars and Archons were waiting for the Sabbat, captured Ruthven, and beat Tabak into torpor. With the Justicars weakened, Dracula swept out of his castle with his loyal retainers and sent the Camarilla running, and then took Ruthven and Tabak to his castle. Dracula coerced Ruthven into embracing him, then turned on the defenseless Tabak and diablerized him, stealing his power. True to his word, Dracula released Ruthven with the admonition to never challenge him. Since then, Ruthven has lived in a sorry state of fear and loathing. Fear that either Dracula or the Eldest will come to settle accounts with him, or that the Sabbat will discover that he was complicit in Dracula's rise and Tabak's destruction. Lambach has tried to confide the events of Cernogh Monastery to other Tzimisce, but their only response is to laugh at him. When Cardinal Polonius summoned the Sabbat to defend New York, Lambach Ruthven answered. The two alone sent 24 Camarilla vampires, including an Archon and the aspiring prince of the city, Michaela, to final death. But the power of the Camarilla and his Justicars was too much. Following the Battle of New York and the conquest of the city by the Camarilla, Ruthven went into hiding. He was discovered by a Xantosa Revenant ghoul, who bid Ruthven to follow him into the sewers of Manhattan. Ruthven obliged the ghoul, and the two went underground, deep underground, in a series of tunnels that had never been on any map of the New York sewer system. In the darkened catacombs, he once again met the Eldest, only now it was a mound of bilious flesh, a tumorous growth seething with chaotic lifeforms emerging and being reabsorbed into itself. The antediluvian told Ruthven that it had always been watching him, and that it now wanted Ruthven to join it. Instead, Ruthven fled from the tunnels, losing an arm as the antediluvian attempted to halt his escape. Since Lambach's escape, he has tried to drown out the memory of that night with the blood of drunks and drug addicts. Unbeknownst to anyone, even Lambach himself, he is the Eldest's eyes and ears on the Tzimisce clan. The antediluvian has even saved Ruthven on more than one occasion by granting him a fragment of its power to allow Ruthven to survive, overcome, or escape. But why? The antediluvian has selected Ruthven as its chronicler, its witness, its first and last worshipper on this earth. Lambach Ruthven, so submissive to the fate that others have chosen for him, has been chosen as the last Tzimisce, and the last creature on earth. When the Tzimisce antediluvian attains true metamorphosis and ascends to a state surpassing Caine, Ruthven shall be the last pair of eyes to look on the Tzimisce antediluvian's apotheosis, before the antediluvian devours him and becomes Azi Dahaka, the eternal dragon of power, rebirth, and chaos. Number 2. Vykos. The Tzimisce who was born Micah Vykos has had a long and curious career, from revenant nobility, to mage, to vampire, to scholar, to anarch, to torturer, to Archbishop of Washington, D.C. But let's start at the start, shall we? Micah Vykos was born in the 10th century to a noble Carpathian line, and was expected to inherit lands and titles in due time. But when Micah reached puberty, he fell into fits and was plagued by strange dreams. After an old herbalist attempted to cure Micah with no success, he was brought to a nearby wizard who recognized the signs of pre-awakening in Micah and recommended that he be sent to the nearest house of the Order of Hermes for training. You may be wondering what house that was. Well, it was none other than House Tremere. Vykos, long before he was a Tzimisce, was a Tremere mage. He quickly learned to control the Tellurian forces of magic in the world. His advancement in the house was smoothed by his prominent family, leading to the establishment of various Tremere chantries in Transylvania. Unfortunately for Micah, his rapid rise brought him into the crosshairs of another brilliant mage who had no taste for new rivals. That mage's name was Goratrix. Micah soon found his advance in House Tremere hampered as Goratrix threw impediments in the way of him performing magic. In 1002 AD, while Micah was traveling on a mission for House Tremere, Goratrix leaked information about Micah's travel route to the Tzimisce, who had identified the Tremere and their chantries as a potential threat. Goratrix hoped the Tzimisce would do him the courtesy of flaying and draining Micah dry. But these Tzimisce were Draconian Tzimisce, progeny of the Dracon of Constantinople and rivals to the Carpathian Tzimisce. Simeon saw the usefulness in having a mage and a Transylvanian noble in his brood, and embraced Micah. After a time, sire and child returned to Constantinople, where Micah came under the tutelage of the Draconian Tzimisce. Micah devoured the libraries of the Byzantines and absorbed the subtle lessons of Byzantine politics and influence. In spite of the enmity between the Draconian and Carpathian Tzimisce, Micah kept correspondence with two Tzimisce in particular, his future confederates in the Anarch Revolt, Lugoj and Velya. Like other vampires in Constantinople, Micah was enamored with the Toreador patriarch of the city, Michael. In an effort to win Michael's favor, Simeon flesh-crafted Micah to better resemble the departed Dracon, and then presented Micah to Michael. Even in his delusional state, Michael saw through the deception, but did not care. Michael encouraged Micah's thirst for more knowledge, and planned to make Micah into a living record of his dream. Micah loved the Toreador. However, Micah chafed under the rule of his grandsire, Jesu, and the limits he placed upon the use of vicissitude among the Obertus and the followers of the divinity within, along with the wrong that Jesu had done to his own brother, Micah's sire, Simeon. When Constantinople fell to the Fourth Crusade, Micah and Simeon were able to take refuge in the Balkans thanks to Micah's secret alliance with Lugoj and Velya. When the Anarch Revolt reached the Carpathians, and the bonds of blood were shattered by the Volderi, Micah's first official act was to torture and diablerize his sire Simeon, who he repeatedly absorbed and regurgitated like some terrible anaconda until he finally brought his sire's torment to an end. Micah coordinated the attacks of the roving Anarch bands against the Tzimisce Voivodes and the Hungarian Ventru. But when the Anarch Revolt failed, as the elders coordinated and consolidated their efforts into what would become the Camarilla, Micah was one of the Anarchs invited to the Convention of Thorns, supposedly to negotiate a peace, but in truth, to accept their terms of surrender. On October 19, 1493, Vykos took the podium and made a speech in defense of the Anarchs and their goals. The Ventru Lord Hardestat responded that Vykos and his ilk were little more than unruly and destructive children, as demonstrated by their own behavior, in desperate need of punishment by their betters. In a fit of pique and contempt, Micah sliced off his own penis and tossed it at Hardestat. On October 22nd, as it became clear that the elders of the Camarilla intended to exact harsh retribution against the Anarchs, Micah warned the Camarilla that the Anarchs were not conquered, nor had a handful of defeats diminished the belief in the righteousness of their cause. If the elders persisted in treating them with contempt, then the Anarchs would answer in terms that the elders could not ignore. On October 24th, one day after the Convention of Thorns was signed and the Assamites were cursed by the Tremere, Micah Vykos led a Sabbat against the nearby town of Silchester, England. This first Sabbat war party rampaged through the town, killing mortals with abandon and flagrantly violating the newly minted masquerade. In the aftermath of the fight against the Camarilla at Silchester, Micah took the name Sasha in honor of an anarch who fell in battle. Sasha Vykos returned to its Carpathian keep, seeking to counter the Camarilla in the Byzantine way, through a legion of mortal catspaws, raiders, brigands, corsairs, and the like. Vykos, shorn of the symbol of manhood, used vicissitude to shape its form into something more to its ever increasingly inhuman tastes. Vykos also thought it hilarious that its old rival, Goretrix, had come to the Sabbat like a whipped dog, seeking shelter against Tremere's wrath. Goretrix had finally hatched one scheme too many. When Vykos returned to active duty within the Sabbat, its return was as bloody as it was spectacular. In addition to summoning the diplomat Radu Bistri to coax the feuding bishops and archbishops into peace, Gorkist also called on Vykos to chastise those Sabbat who would not see the wisdom of unity. Vykos' unique brand of discipline saw those dissenters disappear into some secret dungeon where they would be tortured, or pleasured, or both at the same time for decades before Vykos tired of them. Vykos was now as inhuman on the outside as it was on the inside, appearing as an androgynous, alien creature of unearthly beauty and terror. With the sect temporarily at peace, Vykos pursued its own studies into mysticism and archaeology, hoping to uncover new power. Vykos found itself driven out of Egypt thanks to the Children of Isaac, and then called upon to intervene in the Second Sabbat Civil War, following the assassination of Gorkist. Ironically, Vykos' primary duty was to eliminate dissenters from the Sabbat's rule, the same Vykos who had once stood against the elders of the Camarilla in favor of the freedom of vampires to exist as they chose. As the Second Civil War came to an end, Vykos was granted the title of Priscus, an itinerant advisor to archbishops and bishops, though wise bishops rarely made the mistake of confusing Vykos' advice as anything other than a politely worded command. Vykos assisted in the planning and execution of the Sabbat sieges on the Camarilla's east coast cities of Atlanta and Washington, D.C. In Atlanta, Vykos captured and mutilated the Toreador Primogen Victoria Ash before moving on to the capital of the United States. In recognition of Vykos' contribution, the Regent named Vykos Archbishop of the city it, or rather she by this point, had conquered. Vykos was pleased with the office, although she was a bit miffed that Archbishop Polonia had also been elevated above her to cardinal. She did take some slight pleasure in Polonia being forced out of New York by the Camarilla after nearly 200 years of uninterrupted rule. In addition to her duties as Archbishop, Sasha Vykos spends most of her nights studying Nodist lore relating to Caine and the First City. Despite not being a follower of the Path of Caine, Vykos is one of the preeminent Nodist scholars in the Sabbat, and her hunt for lore has brought her into occasional conflict with the gangrel archaeologist, Beckett. Number 1. Dracula. No discussion of Tzimisce vampires would ever be complete without a long, detailed look at their most famous member, Draculesti Vlad Celsepes Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, the son of the dragon, Voivode of Wallachia, better known to history as Dracula. Vlad Dracula was the second son of Vlad Dracul, Voivode of Wallachia and founder of the House of Draculesti. The Draculesti would spend the better part of a century until the Draculesti prince, Vlad IV, ended the dynasty royal line for good in 1530. Wallachia, located in southern Transylvania, stood at the crossroad of two empires, the Holy Roman Empire to the north and west, and the Ottoman Empire to the south and east. Vlad Dracul was a member of the monarchical chivalric organization called the Order of the Dragon, founded by Sigismund von Luxembourg, King of Hungary, and later Holy Roman Emperor, for the express purpose of keeping the Ottomans out of the West. Vlad II took his appellation Dracul from the old Romanian word for dragon. Dracula, or Draculea, or Draculia, means son of the dragon. Vlad III would earn the name Sepesh, or Impaler, later in life. But the tale of Dracula begins not with the man himself, but with his father, Vlad II, also known as Vlad Dracul. Dracula was the second legitimate son of Vlad Dracul, who was the illegitimate son of Basarab Mircea I, Voivode of Wallachia. The Basarabs of Wallachia, like the Premisils of Bohemia, were a revenant family owing fealty to Clan Tzimisce. Dracula was born between 1428 and 1431. He was Vlad's second son, after his brother Mircea, named for their grandfather. In 1436, when Vlad Dracul's true-born half-brother Alexander I died, Vlad seized control of Wallachia. Unfortunately, Vlad Dracul found himself pressed on all sides, by the Hungarians, by his own disloyal Saxon boyars, by rival voivodes, and by the Ottoman Turks. Acting on the advice of the mysterious Ravnos elder, Durgasin, Vlad Dracul flushed out and killed a few Tzimisce who were terrorizing his villages. The Holy Roman Empire simultaneously withheld resources from the defense of Wallachia and assigned John Hunyadi to deal with the Turkish incursions. Hunyadi, despite his reputation as a fearless Christian crusader, had a greater interest in deposing Vlad and placing a puppet on the Wallachian throne than he did in fighting the Turks. Cut off from aid to the west, Vlad turned to the east and bent his knee to the Ottoman Sultan, Murad II. He then directed his new Ottoman allies to massacre, loot, and enslave the areas of Wallachia under the control of Hungarian sympathizers and disloyal boyars. Meanwhile, Dracula's elder brother, Mircea, attacking under no colors, raided poorly defended Turkish positions and reclaimed fortresses built by his grandfather and namesake. After Ottoman troops were led into an ambush by John Hunyadi in 1442, Murad realized that something was amiss, as Wallachia seemed to be under less Ottoman control than when the war started. The Sultan suspected his new vassal was playing him false, and summoned Vlad Dracul and his two eldest sons to Gallipoli to pay him homage in person. Vlad Dracul suspected that Murad had caught on. He tried to salvage the situation, and instead brought his two younger sons, Vlad Dracul and Radu, with him to pay homage to the Sultan. In case Murad decided to remove his head, Vlad's eldest son Mircea was in position to assume rulership of Wallachia. As predicted, Vlad and his sons were captured and imprisoned by Murad. After Vlad pledged his loyalty to the Sultan, he was allowed to return to Wallachia in exchange for an annual tribute and 500 Wallachian boys to join the Sultan's Janissary Corps. Dracula and Radu would also remain in the fortress of Egrigaz as the Sultan's guests, and to ensure that there were no more misunderstandings between the Voivode and the Sultan. Vlad was forced to stand neutral while Hunyadi, finally shamed into action, entered Wallachia at the head of 4,000 troops, a force that Dracul sneered was smaller than the number of men the Sultan took hunting. Vlad Dracul sent Mircea at the head of 5,000 troops with cannon to meet the Turks at Varna in 1444. The battle ended in disaster for the Christians, who were routed by the Ottomans, and the King of Poland, Vladislaus III, was beheaded by a Turkish mercenary. Hunyadi was captured by Wallachian troops while attempting to return to Hungary and threatened with death. Finally at his wits' end with the impertinent voivode, Hunyadi contacted Vladislav II, scion of the Divinity family, and pledged to support his claim to Wallachia if he killed Vlad Dracul and his son. Vladislav attempted to get assassins to kill Dracul and his son in the fog of war against the Turks, but no one could get close enough to do the deed. Enter Clan Tzimisce. The Carpathian Tzimisce had a long-standing hatred for Vlad Dracul, who was responsible for the deaths of several vampires, and supported the Divinity family over the Draculesti. The Fiends extended their assistance to Vladislav. Vladislav, unaware of exactly who he was dealing with, accepted. The Tzimisce caught Mircea first and buried him alive, but Dracul recognized who, or rather what, was hunting him, and escaped long enough to put together a package of his Order of the Dragon medallion, his Toledo sword, and a letter, then pressed them into the hands of a faithful messenger. In December of 1447, the Tzimisce caught up with Dracul in the marshes of Baltiny. Dracul fought well, for a mortal, but the outcome was a foregone conclusion. Murad was overjoyed when he heard of Dracula's death, and beside himself when he learned of the weak dynasty puppet that John Hunyadi had placed on the throne of Wallachia. In case the Sultan needed to depose Vladislav, he wanted a puppet ruler of his own to hand, one with a legitimate claim to the throne. He began grooming the two sons of Dracul, Vlad III and Radu, for rule. Dracula endured his captivity through study of philosophy, war, and statecraft. Radu preferred to while away his days in the Sultan's harem and became thoroughly Turkified. While Radu would have made the preferable puppet, Vlad III, or Dracula, was the more skilled, decisive, and ruthless brother. Dracula had received his father's medallion, sword, and final words. The hastily written letter instructed Dracula to seek out the vampiress Durga Sin and heed only her counsel, to never yield to the boyars, the Ottomans, or the Tzimisce. Finally, Dracul counseled his son to be prepared to sacrifice everything, all that he loved, all that he had, and all that he desired, to claim the throne of Wallachia and keep it, just as he had sacrificed his beloved sons to the Ottomans. Dracula swore on his father's sword and medallion that his death would be avenged. Vladislav was weak-willed. He had changed sides from the Hungarians to the Ottomans and permitted the boyars to walk all over him. Dracula fought his way from Moldavia to Hunidora Castle, where he shocked the Hungarian court by pledging fealty to the man who had had his father murdered, John Hunyadi. Hunyadi, now aged and bereft of strong vassals, needed a capable young lieutenant more than he needed revenge against the Draculesti. He accepted Dracula's fealty and began instructing him in the Hungarian ways of war, of hit-and-run tactics, and construction of armored battle wagons, the precursor to tanks. Dracula also spent many late nights seeking out the lore of vampires, and the Tzimisce in particular, who had brought down his father and brother. After learning all that he could, he presented himself before the Order of the Dragon in Nuremberg, and took his father's place as the 24th Knight of the Order of the Dragon, pledging to protect Christendom from the forces of the devil and the Ottomans. At the age of 25, after learning all that he could from John Hunyadi, he made preparations to reclaim Wallachia. John Hunyadi died suddenly and inexplicably. 2 weeks later, Dracula launched an attack against Vladislav and killed him in single combat, and claimed the throne of Wallachia for himself. Dracula learned from his father's mistakes. He would serve no master but himself, and give fealty to none but Wallachia. On his ascension, he knew that his most pressing threat came from within his own borders, the disloyal boyars who had caused such trouble for his father and grandfather. He would destroy them first. He hunted down and killed Vladislav's lieutenants and male heirs to put an end to any foreseeable claimants to his throne from that side. He hired a force of mercenaries made up of Wallachians, Hungarians, Saxons, and even Ottomans and Gypsies, and taught them how to fight, and secretly how to slay vampires. The elite of this force became known as Dracula's Axes, and would follow their master beyond the Veil of Death. The boyars were well and truly shaken by this point, and hastily raised an army to destroy Dracula, but the Voivode's own force put them to rout, and killed them all. Dracula then invited the guilty boyars to join him for an Easter feast. Over a grand banquet, Dracula casually asked the assembled boyars how many Wallachian princes they recalled. Just a little harmless trivia. Some boyars named as many as 30. The mood turned dark as Dracula's axes marched into the hall, and Dracula himself condemned the boyars for the high turnover of princes due to their shameful intrigues. He ordered the old and feeble boyars to be impaled, along with their wives. The younger nobles he had shackled and marched for 50 miles until they reached Mount Cetacea. The boyars would work stone by stone to rebuild Castle Dracula from the ruins of Poenari Castle. Dracula commanded that the boyars be worked until they died. This was the beginning of a purge of boyars throughout Wallachia, and with so many vacancies of lands and titles, Dracula filled the newly emptied-out nobility with men loyal to him alone. The remaining boyars took the hint and discovered a newfound love and obedience for their prince. Patronage was as much a political tool for Dracula as terror. He won the loyalty of the clergy with generous tithes and new monasteries, usually constructed with the occasional torture chamber or secret tunnel in case he needed use of them. Despite his burgeoning reputation as an impaler prince, He would, in due course, give his victims a Christian burial, and he made sure to take no action against the Tzimisce, though he did spy on them in anticipation of the day that he would move against the Fiends. Dracula also sent out riders to locate Durga Sin, but they returned empty-handed. Dracula was also keenly aware of spies in his court. Rather than subject them to torture and death, he made use of them and fed them misinformation. Other spies were not so fortunate. When the Germans sent a group of 40 young men to Wallachia on the pretext of learning to speak Romanian, Dracula asked them why they traveled all the way to Wallachia when Hungary or Crisana were closer. When the Germans had no answer, he had them all impaled as spies. When the Saxons rose up against Dracula, he had their villages emptied and every one of their people impaled. I'm slowly developing a picture of Prince Dracula's answer to the German question, both in 1848 and 1946. In 1460, Dan III tried to raise a rebellion in Wallachia against Dracula, accusing the prince of conspiring with the Ottomans. But the Wallachian people would not raise a hand against Dracula. Don III was captured at Rukar. His men were impaled, but he was given the dignity of beheading, right after he dug his own grave. With his throne secure, Dracula turned his attention to the vampires infesting his land. The inept Lambach Ruthven had sent a neonate into Dracula's court as a spy, but Dracula's men knew what to look for and picked out the nocturnal young man and laid a trap for him. As the axes were impaling Don III's men, the Tzimisce spy came amongst them, and the axes were ready. They ran the vampire through with wooden spears. One of them struck true to the heart. The axes raced the Tzimisce back to Castle Dracula. Dracula had the vampire chained and the stake removed. That night, Dracula became a ghoul as he sampled the Tzimisce's blood. It filled him with power and a desire for conquest. He gave his loyal axes doses of vitae as well. Dracula would destroy 3 other Tzimisce vampires for their blood. The clan suddenly took notice of Dracula. The Tzimisce preferred the pliable Dinesti to the clever and brutal Draculesti. Some Tzimisce wanted Dracula dead. Others wanted to embrace him. But the Tzimisce were too bogged down in the Anarch revolt to deal with Dracula at that moment. With his internal enemies neutralized and the vampires occupied, Dracula turned his attention south to the Ottomans. The new Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, also known as Mehmed the Conqueror, was out of patience with Dracula, who had ignored the Sultan's demand for tribute and troops against the Serbians. When Pope Pius II called for a crusade against the Ottomans, only Dracula answered, winning the Pope's favor. When Mehmed sent a delegation to Dracula demanding his aid against Serbia, Dracula famously nailed their turbans to their heads, since they refused to remove them in his presence, a sign of disrespect as far as he was concerned. Dracula then warned the Serbians about the Ottoman plot to secretly invade their lands. Mehmed demanded that Dracula come to Istanbul to discuss the situation. Dracula was amused by this transparent attempt to kidnap him and sent a letter to the Sultan, pleading poverty and Saxon treachery as excuses for why he had not paid tribute and could not travel to meet Mehmed. Dracula put off the Sultan until winter, and then asked Mehmed to send someone to rule Wallachia while he was away. Someone capable. Mehmed sent Hamza Pasha, along with troops and a spy, to escort Dracula to Istanbul. Dracula had the Pasha and his retinue impaled, then disguised himself as the Pasha and rode off to the nearest Ottoman fortress. He rode up to the gates and in flawless Turkish demanded that the commander allow him inside. When the gates opened, Dracula's troops poured into the fortress and killed everyone inside. He then rode across the frozen Danube and raided the Turkish lands between Serbia and the Black Sea. Mehmed broke off the siege of Corinth and marshaled a force of 150,000 men to depose Dracula in favor of his brother, Radu the Handsome, by this time a commander of the Sultan's Janissary Corps and a willing puppet of the Turks. When the Turks crossed the Danube, Dracula baited them into chasing him towards Targoviste, scorching the earth behind him as he went, leaving nothing for the Turks to forage. The Turks' fear grew as they marched through the wasteland Dracula had created for them, as the Impaler raided their foraging parties. In a night raid, Dracula attempted to assassinate Mehmed himself, but he saved his greatest atrocity for Targoviste. When the Turks finally reached the capital, they found hell itself waiting for them. The town had been emptied of occupants. Outside of the town, in a square 3 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide, were 20,000 men, women, and even children, raised high on stakes to greet their would-be Ottoman conqueror. Mehmed II, as he looked upon the forest of death created for him by the Impaler Prince, knew that his will was not the equal of Dracula's. He ordered a massive trench dug around his camp that night to keep out Dracula and his axes. The next day, the bulk of the Sultan's forces marched back to the Danube with all possible speed, leaving Radu to deal with his brother. Radu the Handsome took a different approach than his liege. He recruited the frightened and discontented boyars who had escaped Dracula's purge to his side with promises of privileges and titles. To other Wallachians, he guaranteed that there would be no reprisals from the Turks if they changed sides. Radu's troops were allowed to simply pass by fortresses and towns until they reached Castle Dracula to lay siege to it. Dracula's mistress flung herself from a tower window rather than be taken prisoner. Dracula and his axes escaped through one of the secret passages in the castle and were led to safety in the north by peasants loyal to him. He petitioned Matthias Corvinus, son of John Hunyadi and king of Hungary, for aid in reclaiming Wallachia. Instead, Matthias had him arrested and charged with treason. Dracula expected the Christian world, which he had defended from Turkish invasion, to rise to his defense. Yet, the Saxons of Wallachia and Germany had launched a successful propaganda campaign, pitting Dracula as a blood-crazed fiend and monster, more savage and cruel than the Turks. Worse yet, Pope Pius had died while Dracula was in captivity, depriving him of his most powerful supporter. Dracula languished under house arrest while Radu broke his promises to the boyars and the Wallachians and allowed the Turks to decimate his country. Matthias, fearful of the growing threat on his border, took Dracula out of confinement and permitted him to retake Wallachia. Dracula returned to find his land overrun not only by Turks, but vampires as well. Crazed anarchs drunk on the blood of their elders killed mortals with reckless abandon. But this was a boon for Dracula, as he now had fresh Tzimisce blood to restore his strength after his long confinement. Dracula achieved military success against the Turks, forcing them back to the border, but war no longer held the glory it once had. Imprisonment had given Dracula time to contemplate his own mortality, and he became aware that he desired purpose more than achievement. Once again he sought out Durga Sin, but this time the ancient Ravnos found him. She told him many things in their long nightly discussions, most importantly, how he could attain immortality while remaining free from the petty power struggles of the Jihad. With Durga Sin's advice, Dracula began spying on the anarchs and the elders and laid plans for them both. When he learned that Lambach Ruthven and his sire Tabak had been dispatched to kill him, Dracula knew that his moment had come. Unlike his father, who fell prey to Tzimisce assassins, he would use his killers to his own advantage. Dracula leaked the information about Ruthven and Tabak to the Camarilla spies in his court. As he planned, the Camarilla descended on Ruthven's war party, capturing him and driving his sire into torpor. When both sides were weakened, Dracula and his axes descended from Castle Dracula, killing the remaining Sabbat save for Ruthven and Tabak and driving off the Camarilla Justicars. Dracula returned to his castle and had Ruthven chained and weighted over a freshly prepared stake. He made the Tzimisce an offer: embrace Dracula or be impaled. Ruthven, starved of blood and ever the coward, complied. When Dracula arose, reborn as a true creature of darkness, he turned his fledgling hunger on Tabak and consumed the elder completely, taking his power. He gave his blood to his loyal axes, who were no strangers to ghouldom by this point, only now they were the powerful and immortal ghouls of their eternal Voivode. True to his word, Dracula freed Lambach Ruthven and warned his sire to never challenge him. In late 1476, Dracula faked his death, tired of the intrigues of mortal politics. Durga Sin promised to look in on him from time to time before leaving him in Castle Dracula. Dracula first joined the Camarilla. Despite being a Tzimisce himself, he had no love for the fiends who had murdered his father and brother, conspired against him, and would have slain him had he not outmaneuvered them. He concealed his origins and played at the game of elders for a time. But Dracula grew frustrated with the Camarilla and complained loudly of the dangers of both the Blood Bond and the Antediluvians to his fellows. This was not well received, and Dracula quit in disgust to join the Sabbat, where he fought many of his old allies, though he spared the vampires he considered friends from his wrath. But soon enough he saw the weaknesses in the Sabbat, its unruly, undisciplined pacts, and realized that it could not hope to ever succeed in the task of bringing down the Antediluvians. When he left the Sabbat, a force of paladins was dispatched to punish him. He deposited the warriors in a Sabbat safe house, after tearing them into small chunks, and disappeared again. Dracula joined the Nkanu in the early 19th century, hoping to attain Golconda, the fabled state by which a vampire could transcend the curse of Caine, and perhaps even regain their mortality. Near the end of the 19th century, he hit upon a scheme to rid himself of his pursuers, Camarilla, Sabbat, and mortal alike. He would break the masquerade, and break it in such a way as to elevate himself into legend. During his time in England, Dracula, disguised as the Hungarian Turkologist Armin Vambery, met with an Irish writer and business manager named Bram Stoker. Dracula fired the novelist's imagination with dark and haunting tales from his homeland, interspersed with pieces of his own adventures as a vampire. After several years of research, assisted by Dracula via correspondence, Stoker published his masterpiece novel, aptly named Dracula, to rave critical reviews. Dracula was Eros and Thanatos all rolled into one, an unstoppable killer preying on the blood of innocent women, a beautiful schoolteacher who unraveled Dracula's sinister plot to make London his feeding ground, a chase across Europe, and a huge final battle in the dark shadow of the vampire's lair. The Camarilla attempted to suppress the novel, and Stoker died impoverished. But the novel would find its way into the hands of famous German film director F.W. Murnau, who used it as the inspiration for his 1922 film, Nosferatu. Suddenly, vampires and Dracula exploded into the public consciousness. Curiously, Nosferatu was the only film ever financed and produced by Prana Film, which quickly folded after a legal battle with Stoker's widow. It certainly wouldn't be unheard of for a certain Wallachian vampire to further propagate his legend and then disappear. But the book and the film had the desired effect, and inadvertently did more to strengthen the masquerade than anything the Camarilla had ever done. Now vampires were figures of popular fiction rather than peasant superstition, easily forgotten when put back on the shelf or the lights come back on in the theater. No more torch-wielding mobs to pursue the Impaler Prince. Rumors of Dracula were met with scoffs, as every man turned into a cynic at the mere suggestion of vampires. After his greatest stroke, Dracula again disappeared. In the modern nights, the son of the dragon holds a lonely court in his crumbling castle walls and waits. For what, or rather who, only he knows. And that was the top 10 vampires of Clan Tzimisce. Whew, that was a lot of information. Unlike some, I actually like the Tzimisce. Despite being all about metamorphosis and change, the Tzimisce are unable to truly evolve. They are unable to imagine themselves as anything other than monsters, specifically monstrous feudal overlords of some stripe or variety. Even the Ventrue, as rigid and formalistic as they actually are, have had an easier time adjusting to modern knights than the Tzimisce have, which is why the Tzimisce are slowly decaying into obscurity and irrelevance. And that brings us to the last, but certainly not the least, of the Children of Caine, the vampires of Clan Ventrue. Coming up next, the top 10 vampires of the Clan of Kings, the Blue Bloods, the Warlords. Until next time.